I said last week that I've had some requests for these videos. Right now I just have them in a Google Drive, but I've been a little hesitant to just kind of disperse them widely, trying to give all of you participants an opportunity to say, please don't put these on because my face is on here or something like that. But if there's not a big concern, then I might end up kind of uploading these. Or if that's not any concern, then I'll upload these. Otherwise, I'll keep it private. So we left off last time with Genesis 19, verse 28. It's a long chapter, so we didn't make it all the way through. And of course, 18 and 28 are a pair of stories between Avraham and the tent and Lot and the city, and we've left off with the destruction of Sodom. And picking back up here, we're going to read the end of 29 and then, 19, then take a break, and then I think read 20 together. All right, so really glad that you all are with us today. So chapter 19, verse 29, may the Lord bless the reading of his word. Vayehi b'shachet Elohim et are hakikar, vayizkor Elohim et Avraham, vayishalach et Lot mitoch ha'hafecha v'hafoch et ha'arim asher yashav bachen Lot. I wouldn't normally pause after one verse, but I'm going to pause and translate this one because 30, it's a good breaking point. Then we'll have a long section. Okay, so just translating this. When God destroyed the cities of the plain, the Hakikar, God remembered Avraham, and he sent Lot from the midst of the overturning when he overturned the cities. Trying to reduplicate the repetition there of hafecha and hafoch, in which Lot dwelled. Okay, verse 30. Vaya'al Lot mitzoar, vayeshiv bahar, ushete venotav imo, ki yareh lashevet bitzoar. Vayeshiv ba'ma'ara hu ushete venotav. Verse 31. Vatomer habechira el hatzeira avinu zaken. Ve'ish ein ba'aretz lavo aleinu kederek kol ha'aretz. Lecha nashke et avinu yayin. Nishkava imo unachayeh me avinu zara batashakena et avihen yayin balaylahu batavo habechira batishkav et aviha velo yada b'shekva uvekuma. Stop there and go back and translate verse 30 and following. So Lot went up from Zoar. So remember, he negotiated his way into Zoar in the beginning, and for whatever reason, we're about to see him change his mind. Well, it tells us why. And he dwelled, so he went out from Zoar and he dwelled on the mountain, or in the mountain. And his two daughters were with him because he was afraid to dwell in Zoar. And he dwelled in the cave, he and his two daughters. And he said, and the older, the Bechira, said to the younger, the Tzeira, our father is old, And there is not in the land, this is we can smooth this out. There is no man in the land to enter into us or to come upon us, as is the custom or the way of all the earth. A very general way of talking about having children and sex. So then continue the direct speech, verse 32. Come, it's just make our father drink wine, and let's lie with him, and we will, it's like continue the life of our father, of our old father. Oh, sorry, of our father, the seed of our father. So it's this PL unechaya is to make live, right? So continue the life of the seed from our father. So back to the narrative, their narrator. And they made their father drink wine that night, I would say, in that night. And the older one entered in, and she laid with her father. And he did not know her lying down or her rising. He wasn't aware. Verse 34. Vayehi memocharat vatomer habechira el hatziira hein shachavti emesh et avi nashkenu yayin gam halayla uvoi shikvi imo unechaye me'avinu zara batashkena gam balayla hahu et avihen yayin batakom hatzeira batishkav imo velo yada b'shikva uvakuma bataharena shite venot lot me'avihen. Stop there. Verse 34. Okay, and it was, so we have kind of two temporal markers. The next day, basically, the morrow, it happened that the older one said to the younger one, look, I've laid yesterday, I've laid with our father. Let's make him drink wine also tonight, and enter in, so these imperatives, you go in and lie down with him, and so I might actually say, so that we might progenerate the seed of our father. And the narrator says, they also made him drink wine that night. Their father drink wine that night. And she got up, the younger one, and she lied with him, and he was not aware of her lying down or her rising up. And they became pregnant, the two daughters of Lot, from their father. Okay, one more section, and then we'll pause to talk. Verse 37. Vateled habechira bein vatikra shemo Moav, hu avi Moav, ad hayom, vahatzira gam hi yalada bein, vatikra shemo benami, hu avi vineamo ad hayom. Okay, this is the kind of the conclusion. And the older one bore a son, and she called his name Moab. So she named him Moab. He was the father of the Moabites unto this day. So the Moabites are still around. And the younger one also became pregnant, bore a son, and she named him Ben-Ami, and he is the father of the sons of Ammon, the Ammonites, until this day. Okay, we'll pause there because we have a turn in the story starting in chapter 20. So what observations or questions do you have about this story?
Just from the perspective of, I'm doing this actually with some kids right now, going through Genesis for LTC, so it's really fun. The language of this passage, is there softer language that's available? I mean, I'm not asking for a moment of it, but the writer, are they using really just the softest, kindest language to, I guess, honor the patriarchs in this story, or is it just kind of told? I mean, obviously, it's like not the most crass language to use, but
yeah.
Do you see anything that's told there to kind of help smooth over kind of the patriarch's reputation in the story?
You mean to protect Lot's reputation, or the Moabites, or the Ammonites, or there's definitely euphemism. I mean, there's almost always euphemism in stories that involve sex, but one of the, I think, the interesting interpretive issues here is whether this should be thought of as just this kind of really despicable, incestuous origin of the Ammonites and the Moabites, whether it's meant to sort of defame them, and what about Lot, right? How does Lot come off in this? And it's similar to, we had this kind of discussion with the Sodom and Gomorrah story. How are we supposed to understand Lot? I don't see anything in particular in the use of euphemism where it's really helping us make that decision. Maybe somebody else might see something in here that would help us decide how we are to take this. I'm reading through Klaus Westermann's commentaries of kind of doing this, and he starts out by saying, this might seem really awful to us, but according to the ancient Near Eastern sort of need to prolong the family line, and that's really where this is going, that we shouldn't think of this as these despicable women, who are sleeping with their father, sort of impose our own incestuous, or our understandings of incest upon the story. So it's a bit ambiguous, Ben, I think, like most stories in Genesis. But I think we need to kind of reserve sort of the quick jump anyway to sort of seeing this as a story to really mar the reputation of the characters.
One thing that I was teaching a class one time on Lot, and somebody brought up 2 Peter, I think it's in chapter 2, whenever it's listing all these people that were destroyed, and it lists Lot, and it refers to him as righteous Lot. Basically, his soul was tormented day by day because of Sodom and Gomorrah. Yeah. And that has always kind of stuck with me, because I was going down the path that Lot was not a good guy. Look at all the things that he did. And then they brought that up, and I've always thought about that since then, that in the New Testament, he's viewed as a righteous person, at least enough that Peter writes him down as righteous Lot.
Yeah.
So right. I don't know. I don't know. That has always just sort of influenced my thinking on the story, just because it hit different than what I initially thought.
Right. That's one of the benefits of like doing reception history, of looking at like early interpretations, and they can sometimes call our own interpretations of stories into question, or like give us another take on it. There's some stuff we could talk about here with the Ammonites and the Moabites too, just especially thinking about these characters as they come up in pairs, like in Deuteronomy. They come up twice, one positively and one negatively. Sort of, they're kind of like the Edomites, although the Edomites are a little more closely related, but they're still a part of this kind of Abrahamic line in a way through Lot. This is a relative story. So part of this is just, hey, this is where the Moabites and Edomites came from. But I do think if in comparison with the story about where the Israelites came from, I think it is throwing some shade at the Moabites and the Ammonites. I just can't help but think, even if Westermann doesn't really think it's there, I think it must be, they don't come off well, like their origins. Right? It's not an origin story that you want to tell about your lineage. So it seems to me that it plays into that conversation.
Yeah,
Yeah, Daniel?
I agree. I think that there's a lot going on, and for that, the puns of the names do seem to be puns. Ma'av is from father, and Ben Ami, the son of my people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, which if you read the names that way, definitely are kind of, I wouldn't, it's kind of laughing in a sense at your close neighbors and maybe even your closest relatives that are yet not part of you.
Right. That is kind of like distant relatives that are distinct from you in a bad way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This question of genealogy in my part of the world, where we most of our neighbors, we've got Muslim neighbors. It's very important to see how the seed of promise was specifically through Abraham and not Lot, or through Abraham son Isaac and not Ishmael, and then through Jacob rather than Esau. So I think genealogies have that thing there, but going with what Dusty said, it's important for us to remember that their righteousness compared to the revelation they had and all the idolatry and polytheism that was around is amazing. And so, yes, definitely there is something that it does not sound right, because it is not right.
Yeah.
And yet we go back to the law of Moses and laws about endogamy and think about how those were preserved to keep the tribe's possessions not go to a different tribe. So
there's
maybe Moses is preparing us for some of that as he will lay out the things in the law.
Yeah, I do. I mean, genealogies, you're totally right. I mean, the Toledot formulas and the genealogies in Genesis are, we sort of think of the structure of Genesis being like 1 through 11 and then 12 through 50. But if you just kind of, another way of kind of tracing out the outlining Genesis is by the genealogies. So those play an important role. But then these narratives, especially in the patriarchal narratives about, we're going to have more of these where there's usually barrenness involved. We've seen that already with Sarah and Abraham. And we'll see it with, the origins of Jacob and Esau as well. Just sort of the childbearing stories where the women are, and just narratively, women are usually more active in those stories. They are the main characters in those stories, and they're taking the initiative. Although this is especially true in this story. You've said a lot of other right things, Bloody. But the genealogies thing is important, and where there's this etiological, where people came from, how kind of the world got to be where it is. But we should be reading this, I think, in contrast with like the Sarah bearing Isaac story as well, just like we would, the Hagar story, right? I don't think Lot's daughters actually are, well, they're different stories. Hagar, Rebecca, we could talk about Rebecca. We talk about Leah coming in the tent at night. We could, kind of in secret. There's kind of a secret sex scene. There's a lot of narratives that line up. The other narrative I think that has some overlap with this is the Noah after the flood story, where he gets drunk, and then there's this kind of really difficult passage about what Canaan does to him, whether some would say that's a kind of a sexual encounter, or maybe he's just looking upon the nakedness of Noah. But either way, there's kind of drunkenness and sort of an illicit an experience that happens after that.
I was thinking about your comment on the genealogies. Deuteronomy 23, you talk about no Ammonite or Moabite can enter the assembly down to the 10th generation. And then we find a Moabitess in the genealogy leading to Jesus, which is interesting, just thinking about Boaz and Ruth. And considering her as a Moabitess, and now she is in the genealogy. It's just kind of an interesting I would say juxtaposition, but
Jewish
For sure.
intertextual readings, Jewish intertextual readings connect particularly this story with the Judah Tamar story in Genesis 38, and with Ruth. And there's some really compelling stuff that we'll preach, if it, just to say it casually, the work of some rabbis where they talk about the two first kind of abortive stories, where there's some scandalous type of relationship, and then the Ruth story being a response to that. And I think makes Dusty's point all the more amazing that it's a Moabitess, right? That takes us back to these, and the two genealogies line up, right? The genealogy of the Moabites and at the end of Judge 38 with Perez, and then their heirs meet together in Ruth, and David comes forth from that union. It's kind of a nice intertextual.
Yeah, for sure. That's helpful. It's good. Lady?
The other thing that is making me come to my mind right now is we've got this the old age story question: where did Cain find his wife? And then we think, well, it was okay in that culture, in that time, where the fallenness of the world was not to what it is today, where they actually intermarried with blood relatives to a point. But then we come to the second scripture in the law of Moses that said which sexual relationships were not allowed, and that was one of the father and daughter. And so this kind of preps us. It's like, okay, we've got these stories that I think we read too much with Western eyes, because today in Middle East and in Muslim countries, they don't have a problem marrying their uncle's daughter, which we would think, no, that's not.
Yeah.
So I think these kind of stories kind of prepare us for sometimes for this, and we inject Western eyes, especially eyes that had come from a culture that's been shaped under the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Yeah.
Oh, this is so wrong, what we read here.
Yeah.
Well, it was not so wrong when it was written.
Yeah.
It might have not been as wrong as.
Right. Those cross-cultural experiences like you're talking about, Buddy, are super important for kind of checking ourselves and kind of our assumptions. So I think that's really important what you're bringing up. But we need to listen to a diverse group of readers, read with other people who don't see it like we do. Actually, the mores of sleeping with your family members we're going to keep on talking about in chapter 20. So that kind of segues well. I think I talk more about the Moabite thing, but let's move on and we can come back to it if we want to have more conversation, but I want to read chapter 20 together today. Okay, so chapter 20, verse 1. Vayisa Mishav Avraham Arza HaNegev Vayeshev Bein Kadesh Uvein Shur Vayagor Big Rar Vayomer Avraham El Sarah Ishto Achoti Hi Vayishlach Avimelech Melech Gerar, Vayikach et Sarah. Vayavo Elohim el Avimelech, V'chalom halayla, Vayomer lo, Hinecha met al ha'isha asher lakachta, V'hi be'ulat Baal. Okay, translating verse 1. And Abraham, this is a kind of a regular verb in Genesis. He kind of moves along. He journeyed from there to the land of the Negev, so south. And he dwelled between Kadesh and Shur. And he sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said to Sarah, his wife, "She's my sister." My guess is in a lot of translations, this turns into direct speech, like you say you're my sister. But anyway, the 3FS pronoun. And Avimelech, the king of Gerar, sent, and he took Sarah. And God came to Avimelech in a dream that night. And he said to him, "Look, behold, you are dying, or you're going to die on account of the woman whom you've taken. And she is," this is an odd phrase, but she's married. Baal, the passive participle, she is owned. It's a marriage term for kind of being possessed by a Baal, by a possessor. Okay, verse 4. Va'avimelech lo karav eleha vayomar Adonai hagoy gam tzadik ha-harog halo hu amar li achoti hi v'hi gam hi amara achihu but tom levavi uvenikyon kapai asiti zot. Verse 6. Vayomer elav ha Elohim b'chalom gam anochi yadati ki v'tom levavecha asita zot va'ech sok gam anochi otecha mechato li al kain lo nataticha lingoa eleha. Verse 7. Va'ata hashev eshet ha'ish ki navihu vayit palel ba'adcha vechye ve'im einecha meshiv da ki mot tamut ata v'chol asher lecha, or v'chol asher lach, causal lengthening. Okay, stopping there. So going back to verse 4. Now Avimelech had not drawn near to her, and he said, speaking, "My Lord, will a righteous nation, even a righteous nation, will you kill?" So this is really similar actually to what Abraham says about Sodom. The rhetorical question, hello, did he not say to me, she's my sister? And there's probably a text critical issue in this line, he, gam, he. So we can come back to that if you want to ask about it, but I would just eliminate the first one. I think there's a good argument maybe for this. And even she said, he's my brother. So she also said, he's my brother. In innocence of my heart, in the innocence of my heart, or maybe the blamelessness of my heart, and in the innocence of my hands, I have done this. And he said to him, that God said to him in the dream, I also know that in the blamelessness of your heart, you have done this. And I have kept, or I have withheld, even I have withheld, kept you from sinning against me. Chato, the infinitive construct of chata. Therefore, I have not let you, I would say in English, touch her. I have not given you to touching her. And now, so verse 7, and now return the wife of the man, because he's a prophet, and he shall pray on your behalf and live. An imperative, so basically stay alive. And if if you are not returning, know that, so if you don't return her, maybe emphasize, know that you will surely die, you and everybody who belongs to you. Verse 8. Vayash came Avimelech baboker, vayikra l'chol avadav, vayedaber et kol hadvarim ha'ele be'oznehem. Vayira'u ha'anashim ma'od. Vayikra Elimelech la'Avraham, vayomer lo, me'asita lanu u'mechatati lach, ki heveta alai ba'al mamlachti chata'a gedola, ma'asim asher lo yeasu asita imadi. Verse 10. Vayomer Avimelech El Avraham, Ma ra'ita ki asita et hadavar hazeh. Okay, translating verse 8. And Avimelech, I even want to say Elimelech, which is a name in the Ruth story. So Avimelech got up early in the morning and he called to all of his servants and he said, or he spoke all of these words in their ears, but was Nehem. And the men were very afraid. And Avimelech called to Abraham and he said to him, what have you done to us? How have I sinned against you that you have brought upon me and upon my kingdom this great sin, or a great sin? Deeds which should not be done, you have done with me. And Avimelech said to Abraham, this is a bit of a strange phrase, but ma ra'ita is, so we might want to say, what have I seen that you have done this thing? I think it's usually understood ra'ita as sort of either there's a text critical thing, we want to repoint this, but I forget how it's done. I prepared this, but like it's kind of a repetition of kind of what have I done to you? How have I seen you that you have done this thing? I'll finish reading, then maybe I'll correct myself there. Verse 11. Vayomer Avraham ki amarti rak ein yirat Elohim bamakom hazeh baharaguni al devar ishti vagam amana achoti vatavihi ach lo vat imi vatihi li isha Vayihi ka'asher hit'u oti Elohim mebeit avi va'omar la ze chastech asher ta'asi imadi el kol hamakom asher navod shama imiri li achi hu. Okay, verse 11. And Abraham said, since I said, only there's no fear in, because I said this basically because there's not fear, the fear of God in this land. And they might kill me on account of the matter of my wife. So he's explaining why he said these things. And also, truly, she is my sister, the daughter of my father. Only not the daughter of my mother. And she is to me as a wife. So she is my wife. And when God made me wander from the house of my father, I said to her, this is your chesed, this is your kindness, which you will show with me to every place in which we enter. Say to me or for me, say for me or about me, he's my brother. Okay, verse 14. And this is going to take us to the end. So Vayakach Avimelech son uvakar ba'avadim ushafachot vayatain la'avraham vayashiv lo et Sarah ishto. Verse 15. Vayomer Avimelech hine artsi lifanecha batov be'enecha shev ula Sarah amar hine natati elif kesef la'achich hine hulach kesut einayim l'chol asher itach ve'et kol v'nochachat. Verse 17. Vayit palel Avraham el ha'Elohim. Vayir pa Elohim et Avimelech ve'et ishto va'am hotav vayeledu. Verse 18. Ki atzor atzar Adonai ba'ad kol rechem levet Avimelech al devar Sarah eshet Abraham. Okay, translating in verse 14. And Avimelech took sheep and cattle and male servants and maid servants or female servants, slaves, and he gave them to Abraham. And he returned Sarah, his wife, to him. Verse 15, and Avimelech said, look, my land is before you. What is good in your eyes, or maybe in the good place in your eyes, sit or dwell, shave. Verse 16, and regarding Sarah, he said, look, I have given 1,000 pieces of silver, this is an interesting phrase, to your brother. So actually, he's saying to Sarah, not regarding Sarah. He said, I've given 1,000 pieces of silver to your brother. Behold, it is to you as a kasut einayim, a covering of your eyes. I'll finish translating, I want to talk about that. For all who are with you. And then this is kind of convoluted. And for everyone as this is usually v'nochachat is a nifal participle of yakach, which is to reprove. So it could be as a being reproved, usually taken to be like as a sign of vindication. Okay, verse 17, and Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Avimelech and his wife and his maid, his maid servants, and they bore. So the issue is barrenness, evidently. Because Yahweh had certainly restrained or severely restrained the womb of the house of Avimelech on account of the matter of Sarah, the wife of Abraham. Okay, so in verse 16, where you have Avimelech giving this gift of wealth as a covering of the eyes, like a veil, as a way of sort of telling the world that she is innocent somehow. I think it's usually translated that way more clearly, but the money evidently is a demonstration to others who are with her that she was not touched by Avimelech. All right, so questions or comments? Verse 10, by the way, Ma Ra'ita. What I wanted to say was that like what have you seen, but like what are you thinking? Sort of this kind of seeing is perceiving. How are you perceiving this? Like kind of what was going through your mind? Probably the idea there.
I think the editors of EHS suggest from like, what do you fear?
Right, they're changed. Yeah.
And that actually is repeated later in the narrative. I was afraid that. So it's an interesting possibility too. The consonants could be either.
Absolutely, just kind of move the yod place, and that's a common text critical, ambiguity. Yeah, and that makes more sense. Like, why? Maybe there is this like legitimate question. Yeah, Abraham, why are you so afraid? I mean, we've seen this. Of course, there's source critical issues here, but we've seen it twice now, right? And everywhere they're going, and we've seen it with Egypt. Now we've seen it in Gerar. This issue of Abraham's fear, how it relates to his faith, and so on.
Yeah, the terseness at the beginning with the, she's my wife, really seems to rely on the knowledge of Genesis 12. In other words, that it really seems, it's hard for me to explain the terseness of the early part of this chapter without some awareness that you already know the story of Genesis 12, and you tell the stories together, which is
right. At the beginning of 12, there's a lot more explanation, like more buildup, and this is just she's my wife, or she's my sister, and then Abimelech takes her as his wife. There's no kind of like in the Egyptian story, there's some Egyptians who see her, and then they come tell Pharaoh about her, and then Pharaoh, there's this, you're right, there's a much more buildup there. This is quick to the point.
I think I'm thinking of a couple of things because of this story. First of all, the American expression "underneath the no basis," which is exactly a PR spin. And I don't want to tell you, or I will tell you only what I want to tell you, and I will hide the other part of the story.
Yeah.
Which the intent is what makes Abraham lying, Abraham's word lying, because he's intentionally telling that part of the story to lead them to that conclusion.
Yeah.
So sometimes in a need to know basis, might not be as honest as we would want it to be.
Right. These kind of shades of deception. And what do we make of Abraham's defense? Well, she's my half sister. You know, that's the way I hear it. I don't know if I'm supposed to hear that. Well, she really is my sister, you know, sort of like, I didn't quite lie to you. But then in Abimelech's conversation with God, God acknowledges that, like, the one who's been blameless. And in this case, an innocent tzaddik, and it has a tzaddik nation, is Abimelech and his people. But even though they are going to, it kind of hinges on their decision of him returning his wife. But yeah, there's
the other thing that I was looking into and brought to attention was down in verse 16, where it says about, you said it's like to cover your eyes.
Yeah.
Sort of, it's full bribery in the sense of, I'm covering your eyes. You did not see this, sort of thing. But you said the language sounds a lot like putting a veil of innocence.
Yeah. So that I think that is the image of here, the kasut einayim, right? So kasut is the passive participle in construct. So what is covered of the eyes? Well, I think that I would want to do more research, and maybe somebody knows about like the custom of showing, I don't know what he would not be showing. I mean, she's already is a wife, wouldn't be showing virginity or something here, but wearing some sort of veil as a kind of a covering. But in this case, the money itself, I think, is the kind of metaphorical veil of that is going to demonstrate to others that she is innocent, that she hasn't been touched by Abimelech. And
I think this is where probably some research would help. It might be no connection, but when Abraham sends his servant to pick up a wife for Isaac, when she comes and she sees and asks, "Who's this guy?" That's your husband. She covers herself. Yeah,
that's true. Yeah, there's something to that. Yeah,
I don't know what the language between the two would be. There would be something to look into both.
Yeah, she gets down off of her horse or animal of some sort. Basically, she bows down. But you're right. Yeah. Other comments or questions that? Yeah. I had something about it. I'll think about it. I was going to say, in this story, it's really clear that Abimelech didn't touch her, right? We have that kind of explicitly. However, in Genesis 12, it's not real clear. Like that story doesn't go out of its way to say that, you know, Pharaoh didn't sleep with Sarah, or, you know, or yeah. So there's this kind of, it seems to be a bigger issue for this story. Like they really want the reader to know of her innocence, or of her kind of not sleeping with the guy that is his wife. But I mean, he does take her as a wife, and in chapter 12, the story seems unconcerned with that particular issue.
Do you think that's the placement of this story, and kind of an intentional placement of this interaction, because it's right before the birth of Isaac, so paternity would be a question.
Oh, yeah.
Placement of the story.
Oh, yeah, good. I hadn't thought about that, but that does make good sense, right? So, like, who's going to be the real father? Which that's not a question earlier on.
Yeah, it's interesting to me how the two stories, like what you miss in the Pharaoh story is an explanation of what the plagues were. Right, it just says that plagues were on the household and just kind of moves on.
Yeah.
But here the plague is almost like, I won't go as far as some, but Sarah's infertility is like contagious.
Yeah, because
Right.
everybody's barren, and that is
Right.
Avimelech's death. Yeah,
Right.
it's good.
Can I ask something on that verse? I
Please
think I
do.
told you last week that I have the Stone edition, so you sometimes get interesting insights. That verse 18, they translate that Hashem had completely restrained every orifice of the household of Abimelech. I think you said that it had caused infertility. Is there room in what you're looking at for Stone's translation?
I'm not sure. The word is rechem, so which is womb, and atzar is the verb, which is, and it's got this infinitive apps, like completely restrained. I don't know what orifice would mean there in Stone's interpretation.
They have a citation to Rashi saying all their bodily orifices were blocked: the reproductive organs, the bowels, the ears, and even the noses.
Oh, so that sounds like a later. My guess is that there's some midrashic story that takes off of this. That's not here.
Okay.
As far as I can tell, but the way the rabbis interpret scripture, they're probably not just like making something up. They must, my guess is if you trace that down, they would have some tie in to make them think that, and then there's elaborating on some detail that may not really be there in the story. But I'm not familiar with it, but I'm guessing if you kind of trace that back, Rashi is not the first one to say that. It's just a guess.
But the word you have there is for womb. It's not
Yeah.
broader. Okay,
Right.
Thank you.
Most definitely. Good. I'm glad that you brought that up, though. That's really fascinating.
It is.
No, this is just a fascinating.
Yeah.
That's the Chumash, right? That's the Chumash done by JP. I believe is it JPS the publisher or Art Scroll? What's the
Art Scroll?
Yeah.
Good. Are there other questions? And you can ask Hebrew questions too. It says Hebrew Story Hour. But I think it's fun and important to talk. And what we care about is kind of these stories as stories. But if you're seeking to be here to pick up on some Hebrew, and please feel free to ask those types of questions.
While we're on verse 18, and I was looking back at chapter 12 as well, like how long are we to assume that this story takes place in? Like if it's closing the womb, that seems to be a longer period of time. If it's something more broad that was just brought up, that could be a shorter sort of plague that's going on, more noticeable immediately. So how long are we to assume that Sarah was in the household here?
That's a good question. I mean, it seems like it happens quickly, but that you're right, that last line. I mean, for infertility to be recognized as a widespread phenomenon, you would think that would take a little while. I don't know if that takes weeks or a month. Yeah, what that means. Do we have? I mean, I haven't really thought about it. Can anybody think of any other clues to kind of time in chapter 20?
I wonder if that's for midrashic expansion as well. Like if all the children of the pregnant women are stillborn, then it would be a shorter time. If you imagine that that's part of they're not bearing. But if it's conception that's in mind, then it would have to be some longer period. I wonder what I don't know the reception of this in the rabbinic period. So. Yeah,
if the orifices are shut up, then it wouldn't take very long to notice that.
That's right.
Maybe
that's the impetus of some of those midrashic elements. If it's sooner rather than later.
The commentary there says they could not relieve themselves or give birth until Abraham prayed for them.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I mean, there's obviously a quick relief to this. That happens in the moment of prayer. But there must be a time when Sarah is within the household of Avimelech. But it just doesn't say. I mean, yeah, I might guess like a month, but it's a longer period of time than maybe just reading the story might give you the impression of. Another interesting part of this story is how God speaks to Avimelech in the dreams. And as he's having these dreams of the night, he says, you're going to die. And what's meant by death here evidently is not like personal disease, but of the infertility, kind of the death of his household. But the dreams and the prayer, kind of how these coordinate with each other, like what God is up to in this story. Good. Any kind of final comments or questions?
One final one that's coming to me as you were making these final comments was, are you familiar? I don't know who the guy is, but when I took in interpretation, this was actually Greek interpretation. So, the professor was speaking about this idea of narrated time versus narration time.
Yeah.
And he said, especially in terms of narrative literature, that's one feature that the narrator uses often. If they want to emphasize something, the narrative gets longer. But if they want to just to pass through, they get to have a short comment in passing. And so it seems like this whole story is lengthened, yet when we come to verse 18, we are not told how long this infertility continues. It's like, wants to pass on. I don't know if that is a feature of the Hebrew.
Right.
I did not take Old Testament interpretation.
Yeah, well, I mean, really, it's true of any narrative, right? So, and Hebrew narrative, well, is distinct in some ways, but this difference between narrated time, the time it takes the narrator to tell the story, and the narrator, the distinction of, so the difference between, like, the Hebrew stories use the vayikol for demonstrating action. So this happened, then this happened, this happened. Sometimes there'll be 4 verbs in a row just to kind of speed the story along, and all of a sudden you really skip way ahead in time, although it might just happen in a half a verse or a verse. Even the beginning of this story, Abraham journeyed from there to the land. Well, it just kind of skips from the Sodom and Gomorrah story to the next story quickly. It doesn't give you any sense of time, but then the opposite of that would be direct speech. As in direct speech, we are hearing the time of the story as we are reading it. There's a sequencing of those two. And Hebrew narrative is especially keen on using direct speech for characterization, rather than the narrator telling you this is what about characterization. You sort of have to pick it up from direct speech. And that's one of the reasons why it's so hard, even in a story like this, to think about, well, how is Abraham being characterized, or Lot in the last story? We have to pick that up from actions and words. And sometimes the narrator would tell you something, and when the narrator does tell you something, we should really pay attention. It just doesn't happen that often in Hebrew narrative. But if you compare that with, like, Russian novels, would be the opposite of this, where anybody's like into Dostoevsky or something, you read one of his novels, he's going to give you all of this inner dialogue that the characters are having. You're going to have a real sense of the character's struggle from what the narrator is telling you. The Hebrew is like the opposite of that.
Like Hemingway.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Hemingway. Right. Just really trying to get the inner psyche.
Dialogue.
Yeah. Oh, Hemingway is all dialogue. That's what we're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, there's very little narrative explanation, and all
Yeah.
your characterization comes in these kind of terse comments that are made throughout the dialogue.
Yeah. Which makes for a really open kind of story it involves the interpreter in making valuations about character and so on. Even when we get to like, this is true for the patriarchal narratives, especially. This is one reason why we talk about, well, the ambiguity around the characters.
I think that's why we always have to come back and read it again.
Yeah,
right.
And read it in community.
And read it in community, right? Excellent.
Yeah. All right. Well, this is a highlight of my week. I appreciate you all being with me. We won't meet next week. Happy Thanksgiving if you're in the US, or otherwise you can give thanks too. But we will pick it back up the following week. So please join me in 2 weeks and spread the word to other interested readers. Thanks, everybody. I'll stick around for a minute if you want to talk. Otherwise, I'll stop the recording here.